Welcome to the Psychosphere. I'm David Sutcliffe, and my guest today is Chris Arnade. Chris is a freelance writer and photographer whose work has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Guardian, The Washington Post, The Financial Times, and The Wall Street Journal, among many others. He has a PhD in physics from Johns Hopkins University and worked for 20 years as a trader at an elite Wall Street bank before leaving in 2012 to document addiction and poverty in the Bronx and across the U.S. The result is his 2019 book, Dignity: Seeking Respect in Backrow America. I highly recommend you purchase and read this book. It is a heartbreaking and beautiful document about a group of Americans who have largely been ignored and forgotten. I've been a fan of his since 2015, so it was a great pleasure to sit down and speak with him. Please enjoy my conversation with Chris Arnade. I first discovered you on Twitter, where you are a strong personality on Twitter.
Yeah, I probably should be off Twitter.
Why do you say that?
Because I think it's not for the most nuanced views, and I think I'm a little bit. Twitter gets me angry because the people on Twitter are not necessarily representative of the broader public.
Yeah, no, that's for sure. But I find that you have a pretty good way of handling it. Maybe that's not your own perception from the outside looking in. You seem to be, you never come across as aggressive or angry, sometimes a little annoyed or frustrated, disappointed maybe. But I don't know, I really enjoy your perspective and your presence on
Thank
Twitter.
you.
Yeah. So I came across 2015, I think, I read one of your posts on Medium, and where you first started talking about this, what was going on with Trump and trying to put it into some kind of socioeconomic context. And I found that really comforting to read, because I thought that the conversation that was being had was absurd to me,
Right.
and disappointing. Because something was clearly going on, and my people, which was the left, I'm originally from Canada and very liberal, went to Hollywood, and all my friends were liberal, were just denouncing all these people who were supporting Trump as just racist, backward, ugly, and I found it distasteful, and so reading that first blog post of yours, it just gave it a perspective, and it humanized it in a way that was. I just was immediately interested in your point of view. How's that been for you, this new identity as somebody was a Wall Street guy, and now you are a photographer, journalist, thinker?
Yeah, it's been part of the problem is get the focus off of me and onto the people I write about. Because I appreciate that the reason I have a platform is because of my story. If I had been doing this and I hadn't been a banker, I don't think as many people would be interested. So there's this combination of using, I will say, a gimmick almost to get people, and the media clearly cares about that angle. And so I've accepted it, even though I'd rather not the focus be on me. And I think where I'm weakest is explaining to people. And when I was doing my book promotion, I'm not a big fan of promotion to begin with, but I want people to read the book. And so it was hard to navigate that. The question I get answered all the time, and the very first question is, explain why you did it. And it's not something I have a good answer for. Certainly not a 15-second soundbite. And that's hurt me, I think, in some of the promotions, because even though I know it's coming, I still can't really answer it fully, because I don't really like the focus on me, because I prefer it to be about the people I document, but also because I don't really know if there's a 15-second answer to that question about why I did this, that really, that satisfies people and satisfies me, because I'm not really sure why I did it, to be honest.
Yeah, well, that is the most it's an interesting question to to
Right. And so,
unpack. Yeah.
I understand why people ask it, and I'm not angry when they ask it. But even then I still don't really have a great answer for it. And some of it's the fact that, some of it's, the general stock answer is I was just tired of what I was doing. I think given your life story, you understand that. You wake up at some point. For me, it wasn't, I didn't have that, that epiphany that, oh, this is so wrong. It was just a slow, gradual erosion of the ground beneath my feet. And at some point times that, you look down, you go, shit, there's not much ground underneath my feet. And it was harder for me because I have a family that,
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember the book or the movie, Mosquito Coast. Paul Thoreau. It's about a guy who goes on a personal journey, ends up dragging his family into hell.
Right.
It's great for me to go on my personal journey, but it's not great for me to drag my family through hell. So I was, I had a very comfortable job. We had a luxurious apartment in the nicest neighborhood in Brooklyn. My kids went to good schools. And, with minimal amount of work, I could make good money and provide them with everything they wanted, which is more than I wanted. And at some point, to simply say I'm going to stop doing that, that's unfair to them, perhaps. That's not necessarily what I, so it was harder in that sense. I mean, a lot of my feet dragging about why it took so long to get here for me was obligations to my family. But, eventually I worked on setting it up so that I had enough money if we moved here upstate, after my oldest daughter went through high school, finished her high school, that we could, I could give them the lifestyle they expected and wanted, and also at the same time do this project and what I wanted to do.
How did your family take it? I mean, particularly your wife. I'm curious about that. When you started these long walks and started to photograph and then dedicate more of your life to it, what was her reaction?
I think for people who, like, we got married at the age of 23, so she's known me for a long time. And for people who who've known me since college, which is where she met me being a banker was the more strange behavior.
Okay.
So, I didn't, I came out of particle physics. I was a PhD in particle physics, and then I became a banker. And if you asked me a year before I became a banker what a bank was, I don't think I could have told you. Beyond, or what a bond was different from a stock. So that was kind of the stranger behavior. And so part of the missing of the story that I haven't really told in my book is, because I didn't make it about me, is I was always a bit of an oddity on Wall Street. So I was taking those long walks when I was still working, when I was the most bankery type of person ever. I was still, the very first day I got to New York City, I think it was like August 3rd, 1993. I can't believe I remember that. I didn't know anything about New York City, so I took the A train all the way up to the Cloisters, which is where the Broadway ends. And I walked 22 miles home to Brooklyn Heights, my neighborhood. So I'd always, and when the kids were in diapers, I would bundle them up put them on the subway, and then go to the end of the subway and walk with them. So I was always doing those walks. It just became something different as my career advanced and the kids got older, and my job got, quote, easier. So I had more free time to carry my camera around and actually turn those walks into, more about learning and less about just seeing.
Was it New York City that you started to walk, or had you been a walker your entire life?
I've always walked those walks, but New York City gave me the best platform to do it because it's such a great walking city. I went to university at Johns Hopkins, so I walk there too. It just has less less options for walking. I really do believe that the way to see a city is to walk it. Or public transportation, those are the two. So one of the things I didn't write about in my book is whenever I went to a place, I would try to use the public transportation. And so even though I did drive a lot of places, so for instance, when I was in LA, I stayed in, if your listeners know LA, I stayed in parts of LA that few people stayed in. I stayed in Downey, and Pico Rivera. I try to take buses everywhere. And that's tough. You learn a lot when you take a bus. I mean, one of the just small details, one of the few things you learn very quickly is, and someone else wrote about this, and it was a really interesting piece, shade. Bus stops in poor neighborhoods don't have shade. And so you spend a lot of time sweating and getting burned, and you'll have a small tree that 5 people are hovered around because it's the only shade provided, in these poorer neighborhoods. But you just see another side of LA that I don't think a lot of people see, is when you use the bus system. But LA is not a good walking town. It's probably the worst walking town I've had. I love Downey and I love Pico Rivera, and but hell if I'm going to walk in that town. It's absolute misery to try to walk.
If you're open to it, I'd love to, I don't know, deconstruct a little bit about why you did choose this path emotionally, psychologically. I wonder, because reading your book, you felt like an outsider when you were growing up a little bit. Then you get to Wall Street, you feel like an outsider. And I wonder if there was something in going into these neighborhoods, these are outsiders in some way. Are you searching for something inside yourself? Is there something that wants to be resolved inside you in this endeavor?
There's a term, I think it's coined. I grew up odd. And another thing I didn't fully mention in my book was my father was, the way we traveled all the time as children. I come from a large family, and my dad was a professor, and we were the outsiders in our town because he was probably the only professor in town. It's a small southern town, but we would spend a year living in Nigeria. Every third year, we'd go do something crazy, and the trips we would take were kind of like the trips I would take. We were clear, as somebody said about my father, which is true of me, he was happiest when he was in a place he shouldn't have been. So wherever the worst things were going on in the world, that's where we'd go. So if there was, I remember when there was Angola, for people who of my age remember Angola, there was a civil war in Angola. So we went to the then called the Southwest Africa, now it's called Namibia. We went to the Namibia-Angola border to for him to learn about the resistance movement. So that kind of, there's a term for people who grew up kind of diplomats' kids or missionary kids, which is called, I think, third culture kids. People who are never fully immersed in their culture, in any one culture, and so are kind of observers, people who kind of sit on the fringes and watch stuff. So that's always kind of been the way I'm very experimental. I believe I'm very experiential. I will always try something new to learn about it, and be the observer. I grew up, my dad was Jewish, my mother was Baptist, but I grew up Catholic, so I was never any of the three. And so you always become kind of someone who's not fully immersed in one culture, and that makes you somebody. I tend to find those people tend to be people who tend to be anthropologists, or people who document and watch and kind of take out and observe. And at a very selfish level, the walks were just, for me, it was a very great way to learn. It was the ability to travel. When you go to New York City, it's basically 70 different neighborhoods stitched together by a subway system. And so I used to say, when I got there, I could just take a token and go to any different country. There was a period of my life when I tried to go to, I went through the alphabet of all the different countries, and I tried to go to a bar or a restaurant of every country in New York City, starting with Albania and ending with Zaire. So there's a bit of there's a bit of the collector thing there, but there's also the bit of the observer, which is to kind of learn. And at a personal level, that makes me happy. At a very, very personal level, there was this really absurd period of my life, maybe 2 years, when I was doing this project, and ended up focusing on the Bronx, this one particular neighborhood in the Bronx, Hunts Point,
Mm-hmm.
where I had started realizing this was a project, and I started spending time with a street family of homeless addicts. Um, Crawling under bridges with them, going into crack houses, taking pictures, writing their stories, taking them to detox, visiting them in Rikers jail, taking them, to Lincoln Memorial Hospital, just getting immersed. Where I was still working on Wall Street, doing this on the weekends, and I would take a Friday off and do 3-day weekends of this, or I'd go up on a Tuesday night. And so it was just absurd. I was, in crack houses on the weekends and on a trading floor on the weekday, and it just couldn't go on. Just the fatigue was too much, and the juxtaposition was just too great. And I had to choose one, and I chose the one where I was happiest. So at a very personal, selfish level, it's where I was happiest. I preferred doing this.
What about it made you happy?
The people I enjoy. I get. There was. I think I don't want to. I don't want to romanticize the poor, because there's a lot of bad people who are poor. I mean, just like,
Yeah.
it's not these beautiful angels. I'm not there to save them. I'm there to hang out with them. And what it was a lack of pretense. It's just like, you didn't have to watch your language. You didn't, there wasn't the arrogance. It was just, to put it in mathematical terms, when I did physics, I like cosmology. I study the big questions, the boundaries. When you push things to the really edge, I think you learn about the core about ourselves. So to learn about how matter is made, we push things to the extremes and then slam them together and see the explosion. I kind of say that's that's like when you're hanging out with homeless addicts. It's life pushed to the extreme,
Right.
and what's exposed is the interior, the core, the quirks of life, as I call it. The three or four lessons that drive us all, that are fundamental, and you see that when you're pushed to the edge. When you're at Wall Street, surrounded by bankers, those things, those kind of driving necessities of life, those driving things that make us human, are all clouded and surrounded by luxury, and so it's harder to peel back the onion and see truths. And so I was learning more at a fundamental level, but also I was around people who were less arrogant.
Yeah.
And you also didn't have to, you didn't have to watch your language. They're just, they're funny as fuck. And so it was just, at a selfish level, I was learning a lot, and at a selfless level, it was just kind of, it, it was just being around people who I felt were, for a lack of a better word, more real.
Do you think about it in terms of your own like spiritual journey, like because you're taking yourself to the edge in some way, putting yourself in some extreme circumstances, associating with people who are living in a certain kind of way, very close to poverty and addiction, and you're surrounding yourself with that, and being in that environment has an impact on you, and it did. These people became your friends, and I know in the book at one point you said you struggled with your own addiction issues, but just being around that level of sadness and pain and trauma must have had an impact on you.
Yeah, it wears you down, and I don't want to use it as an excuse for why I drank so much, because that's an excuse. But the bigger issue for me at a personal level, and why I had to stop at some level, was you just lose sense of perception you don't want to be I don't want to be that person who always, when anybody has a problem, says, well, what about the third world?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's what I was becoming, which was when my family was, oh, my daughter is struggling, in math. I don't want to be the person who's like, kind of rolls my eyes and say, well, what about, you're lucky you have this house. I don't want to be that person who's always not denying people their happiness because someone else is less fortunate than them. And so that perspective kind of drove me to a point where I think I was becoming irritating. But it was also just, I just wrote a book review of another book that's similar to my book called Tightrope, by a New York Times op-ed writer. And what I also didn't want to be is become someone who has a savior complex. And that's what that book is where to truly respect somebody as an individual, you let them be, you don't spend your life pestering them saying, hey, you need to get clean. Hey, you need to do this. Hey, you need to do this. You allow them the dignity to recognize that they have agency and they can do what they want to do. And I found myself becoming more and more trying to save people, which is just not the right thing to do. And and then after that, it also became just depressing. I mean, and so I had to get out for my own personal, sanity. But, in terms of what changed me is, again, I will say that I'm very glad I did the 6-year project. I learned more, or 7-year. I learned more during this project than I did getting a PhD in physics, and I learned more than my 20 years in Wall Street. I'm very glad I did it. But at the same time, it's completely changed me, and it's not necessarily fair, again, to my lifetime friends who, I have less, at a personal level, I have less tolerance for things that other people enjoy. And that's not fair, because I shouldn't deny, if somebody wants to have a nice wedding, they should have a nice wedding. It shouldn't be for me to say, oh, Jesus, this, I was just, you should have seen what happens over there. You allow people to have their own happiness. And at a personal level, what the biggest change I would say for me is a recognition of faith as a person from science. And I mean faith in a very broad term. I don't mean just in the Quran or else the Bible. I mean in, New Age stuff. I mean in spirituality. However anybody finds, we have the educated class, the kind of people who control stuff. I call them the front row in my book. We have a very narrow definition of what is approved, and that is a very secular rationalist approach.
Yeah.
And if you are somebody who has a differing form of how you find spirituality, if you have energy rocks, or if you have snakes, or if you have snakes or speak in tongues, all these are looked at as kind of undignified, and whereas for me, what I saw was during the 7 years is those are extraordinarily powerful, not just as ways to deal with a life, but as ways, not just as a opiate of the masses, which is a really demeaning way to look at religion, but as a way, or faith is spirituality, but as a way to, as a valid truth. If somebody can find meaning through meditation or through snake handling, go for it, man. That's as much, that's to me, and that's been the biggest change, is recognizing that and understanding why people will do something along those lines that I wouldn't necessarily have done.
Yeah, I always think that people are going to worship something. It's going to be money, it's going to be your career, sex, or some kind of spirituality, some kind of God. And I recently started, not recently, but 3-4 years ago, started working with a Lakota man just because I was fascinated with the songs. And he introduced me into their religious, I mean, they don't call it a religion, but their belief system. And I really started to understand as I went to Sweat Lodge and went to South Dakota and saw the Sundance and did some vision quests, like the power of belief and the power of faith and what it adds to your life. And so, yeah, I resonate with that idea that the religion as the opiate for the masses feels very condescending, and it creates a lot of separation, which, again, is one of the things that I really resonate about your message is just, and I think why, not that we need to bring it back to Trump, but again, why we got Trump, at least on one level, was just this disconnection from this part of the country, condescension, and of Backrow America, just really a lack of recognition, a lack of compassion, a lack of understanding, and an unwillingness to look at it.
Right. It was very as you said at the very beginning, what really frustrated me and how I kind of got into writing this book, and this project, which started in 2010, from me walking into neighborhoods with my camera, ended up being 4 years in the Bronx with homeless addicts. Then I eventually went on the road when the Bronx got to be too much personally, but also going back to the earlier thing, intellectually, I wanted to see what I learned, those quirks of life that I discovered in the Bronx were translationally invariant. Were they also true in, Milwaukee? Were they also true in El Paso? And so I got in my car and did that. And, the thing that it just happened to overlap with the election. And I wasn't, it's fascinating that to many people I'm known as a person, and how you saw me as somebody who was, quote, explaining Trump voters, because part of the reason I was going to these white working class neighborhoods is because it was pointed out that if I was going to focus on poverty, it was unfair to focus on only minorities. Because although minorities are disproportionately represented as poor, they're not the only poor.
Yeah.
And so I ended up intentionally going to white working class neighborhoods because I was going to do this project on poverty. And I wanted to see if what I learned in Hunts Point, a minority neighborhood, was true in West Virginia, a non-minority neighborhood. And it took place right against the election. And so I had no interest in writing about politics, but what's so frustrating, as we spoke about earlier, is part of the way I kept notes and part of the way I kept, it was on Twitter. I would kind of tweet my observations as ways to think about my thoughts, to see if they, I would type up my notes at night, but then I would tweet them also to get feedback, to see if am I completely fucking off the charts here? Here I am by myself writing these notes up. Am I that, and when I was on Twitter, again, it was that disconnect of here I was seeing this thing. And I as a scientist, I really thought people would say, "Oh, this is really interesting." What I'm seeing is that there's this great frustration. There's this educational divide in the country that is often as big as a racial divide, and that the poor, the undereducated, as you were, no matter what race, were equally frustrated, and how that frustration got rendered was a function of race. If you were poor and white, you could vote for Trump, and if you were poor and black, you just didn't vote. In both cases, you're saying, I'm frustrated with the status quo. And I thought people would go, yeah, that's really interesting, And on Twitter, I was called a racist. I was called an asshole. And I was like, what? That wasn't, I'm sitting here trying to warn you that unless something changes, Trump's going to win. And you're telling me that I support Trump, and I don't support Trump. I'm just warning you, he's going to win. And what was really disappointing to me, because as someone who comes from the left, was to see people with very privileged backgrounds on the left who had large platforms mocking Trump voters as a group, and mocking the white working class as a group, when they themselves have rightfully pushed back when the right mocks minority communities.
Yeah.
When the right says, if you look at the aggregate behavior of a group and assign it a quality that's subhuman, then you're doing it wrong. That's not the left. That's, the right does that to minority communities. They look at them, they say they're deviant, they're lazy, they're more violent, and all these awful accusations that the left pushes back against, rightfully, correctly. And when here, all of a sudden, here now the shoe's on the other foot, and the left is, and some people, not all, a lot of people, it was, a few very privileged, were doing that about Trump voters. And I was like, well, maybe you shouldn't do that. But maybe it's kind of a canary in the coal mine. Maybe what you're seeing here is that people are just really tired of being mocked, and tired of being, condescended to, and tired of being treated like subhumans. I remember once when I was in some trailer park in West Virginia with a family of addicts. It was a family, and I remember I forgot why I asked them the question, or the context of the question, but there was this theme going around that the white working class has white privilege,
Right.
And I remember asking this guy who, was living in a trailer that barely had electricity. And, I'd given him $20 to supposedly take, because he needed to get to his rehab clinic, but I knew I was going to go to drugs. I can just, don't lie to me, but I'll do it anyways because, I spent the day with you and you've been good to me. I remember I just asked him about something about, do you feel like you have privilege here? he's like, you just look around you. Are you serious? So yes, the white working class has privilege relative to the black working class, but that's not who's telling them they have privilege. Who's telling them they have privilege is a Harvard law professor. And if people can't see that, it's just, telling a group that they have privilege when you yourself have more privilege is not going to be the way to win them over to your views.
Yeah, no, exactly. Not only is putting all the Trump voters into one category and pathologizing them and calling them racist, it's immoral. It's unethical. It's also not a good strategy to get them to vote for you. I mean, that's the thing that was most confusing to me. It's like, you're going to alienate these people. They're never going to vote for you. Like, you're not going to win.
Well, there's two things I say about that. One is I jokingly say the left comes into these neighborhoods and says, your job is obsolete, your lifestyle is icky, you should probably move, now vote for me.
Yeah, exactly.
But the other thing I would say is, what's so frustrating about it is in addiction, there's this term I call owning the addiction. There comes a point when addicts are so sick of being mocked or so tired of being mocked, to use aggressive language, because I spend a lot of time with prostitutes who are, often, unfortunately, if you're a poor addict and you're a woman, you're going to prostitute to make money.
Yeah.
And many men do that as well. And they do sex work because that's the easiest way to get money. And I remember one of them saying, eventually they get sick of being, you're a dirty hoe, right? You're a dirty, lazy hoe. Eventually they own it. They're like, yo, I'm a,
right.
That's it. They're proud of it. Own the stigma. Like,
I'm a deplorable.
Yes. And so that's what ended up happening with Trump people. Eventually enough of them started owning the stigma. You're going to call me a racist no matter what I do? Fine. Then might as well just be a racist, and to basically make fun of you. And it becomes this really ugly cycle, that downward spiral, which, I don't, is there a lot of racism amongst the white working class? Yes, it's bad.
Yeah.
But is it a binary thing that can never be changed? No, it ebbs and flows. Racism is a result of many things, and racism just all of a sudden pop into existence. There's a condition that causes it. And, I wrote about this in my book, or I tried to illustrate this in my book when I talked about the Somali community in Lewiston, Maine. How the conditions were created that were ripe for a pushback against their existence, and how that played out in a very ugly way. And I think, if your goal is to, quote, diminish racism, then, I often say is we've created the perfect environment we've produced the perfect environment for a conducive environment for the production of racism. And that's bad. Like, nobody's defending. You're hard pressed to find anything other than 2% of the population who defends racism.
Yeah.
People want it to get. There's nobody out there who's actively supporting it. And so, yeah, it was just this. But for me, just where we started the conversation, for me, going back to Twitter, it was really frustrating because I had really thought that. And then when Trump won at a selfish level, I mean, the personal silver lining was like, well, at least people will now take what I say more seriously, because I was warning about this, and of course not.
No, they doubled down.
Now all of a sudden I was responsible for Trump, and it's like, oh, come on. So, and I feel kind of like there was the same way with you just try to warn people, like you're just making the situation worse here. Stop talking down to the working class, white blacks up. Stop treating them like kids who need to be talked down to and reformed. Take their anger seriously, and understand that unless something changes, that anger is going to get worse, and that's not a good thing. I don't want the working class to be angry. I don't want to romanticize them. They got some really bad fucking tendencies and flaws. So
in your book, you're pretty fair with their motives. This idea that the left actually has good intentions, but I wonder if that's true. I mean, I think consciously they say they do, but it feels to me, what I see is like, I have power, I have money, I have status, and I want to hold on to it. And that, we talk about this idea of virtue signaling, that a lot of the politics are really about holding on to their social status, saying the right things. It becomes their own religion, really.
I mean, I completely agree with that part. See, but that's almost why I don't think. I mean, so for instance, let's talk about let's frame in the religious framework. If a missionary goes into, a Catholic missionary goes into India, right, or goes into Taipei,
yeah,
they can cause a lot of damage.
Yeah.
But they have good intentions. I mean, again, they really think they're coming from, and that's actually can be a worse case, right? Because I often say, for instance, so the libertarians in Wall Street I used to work with, who will, at least they're honest when they, I don't like their policies. I don't like the way that, there's some things I like them about, but they're kind of like, oh, the poor deserve what they got. At least they're honest about their intentions. And I can argue.
Yeah.
I can argue with them. I can generally just say, well, no, that's your point of view. It's when somebody actually thinks they're helping and they're doing more damage. So it's like the Christoph book that I just reviewed, this Tightrope. They think that the way to help the poor is by them becoming the poor. The poor need to become op-ed writers in New York Times. They need to live. They need to get reformed, get education, and do exactly what Nick Kristof, the op-ed writer, did. He's coming from a good place. I don't doubt that. He really cares about the poverty that he sees, but his solution, you have to become like me, to me is a form of religious saving. It's like it's denying them the agency to say, just maybe they don't want to be like you. Maybe they don't want to live in New York City. Maybe they don't want to uproot their family. Maybe they don't want to, go to 5 different, get into the resume arms race to get credentials to be and give up their faith to be accepted into your new religion, your secular religion that demands you believe all these things. The problem is I will never argue with Nick Kristof because he won't bother to argue with me, but there's no convincing him of this. Like, I mean, he's so deep. He so fully believes that his way of living is the sacred way, the religious way. And again, I don't doubt that he really does believe he is helping these people. And so consequently, I think he can do more damage often. Beware of somebody with good intentions, because, it's like, so I'm not as cynical as you are, but that doesn't mean I don't necessarily think it's, I think subconsciously, maybe not explicitly, implicitly, look, their lifestyle is threatened by this.
Yeah.
So yeah, they're defending something, and so it's harder to get to the next intellectual loophole.
Yeah.
But they can completely say, how can I possibly be racist when I support the following 5 policies, even though I live in a segregated neighborhood, where the only minorities here have PhDs, like me, and I remember when I was, in my neighborhood, my Brooklyn Heights neighborhood is a perfect example of that. I don't know if you know New York City.
A little bit.
Brooklyn Heights is a very wealthy neighborhood. It's also very liberal, and it's a lot of artists live there. I think the most famous person from your world is the guy from uh, what's this, Paul Giamatti? Is that his name? The actor?
Yeah.
Like his kids used to go to school with my kids, that sort of thing. Um, Very leftist, but and very quote diverse. There's but everybody is has a PhD basically, or and so there's also no buses allowed in my neighborhood. So part of the reason is, because it's a historic district quote, but also it means that if I found this out when I broke my ankle, like there's no buses here. Like, I have to walk 8 blocks. They've set the neighborhood up so it's very hard for the poor.
That is where we lost connection, and we picked up the conversation a few days later. I was going to ask you about what you were going to do next, project on global slums. So that's going to require more traveling, obviously,
Right.
all over the world. The same approach you're going to take?
Yeah, I mean, this time I'm going to be a little bit more methodical about it. I kind of narrowed it down to like I think I got a list of 8 places, 2 on each continent, and what I'll do is I'll visit each one for about a month, and then go back for 4 months.
Okay.
To do it
Right,
properly.
right. 4 months.
After I narrow it down to maybe 6 places or 5 places, but I did the first month in August. I went to Jakarta and spent all of that month in in Indonesia. They're called kampongs, Kampunг. So I went to the kampongs and just hung out for a month, and that's how I kind of work. I just kind of hang out. I didn't bring my camera. I just walked around and just kind of scoped out and got a sense of what it was and why it worked and why it didn't work. And then the goal was, once I narrowed it down to 2 or 3 neighborhoods, to maybe go back and spend 3 months there with somebody, a local who can help me translate. So, so I was going to go to India this summer, but I can't do that. It doesn't look like, I don't think we're going to be traveling anytime soon.
Is your intention with all of these projects what is your intention with these projects?
As like we kind of spoke last time, it's a little bit of personal, intellectual curiosity. But, it's kind of like what I did with the book on dignity. The thing about the global slums is, 1 billion people live in these towns, and no one sees them. Other than the people who live there. I don't, when I was in Jakarta, no tourists, a lot of tourists go to Indonesia, they go to Bali, they don't go to Jakarta. And if they go to Jakarta, they get the hell out of there real quickly. They certainly don't go to the neighborhoods I went to. And 10 million people in Jakarta live like that.
Yeah.
5 million people, they're big. They're a big part of the way our world operates. And it's always kind of interested me that something can be so big and so integral, and yet we don't really talk about it much. And if we talk about it, it's usually by people like me who go there and then generally stay only 2 days and say bad things about it.
Yeah, that's the impression I got. It's like, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like, I want to show you this. Like, you need to see this. We need to look at this. And I even noticed, and I'm a fan of yours. I'm a fan of your work. When I went to your Flickr account and saw all the pictures of the faces of addiction, there was a part of me, it's like, I don't want to look at this. I don't want to see this.
Right. And there's stuff I took off that, you believe me, you don't want to see, because
yeah,
it's
I'm
a little more shocking. Yeah, in the perfect world, someone from Jakarta, from the Kampungs, would tell their own story and we'd listen to it, but that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
So I'll try to be a middleman in some senses of helping them, and then there's the part of me that I like it. I enjoy it.
Yeah.
I literally enjoyed spending a month in what are, Indonesian slums. I got a lot of intellectual fulfillment out of that. I enjoyed talking to the people. I learned a lot. to be cliched, you only do live once, and so you might as well experience as so many things as possible. But again, it reminded me, I don't know if this took place since we last spoke, but one of the things that the skate park in LA got closed. I don't know if you saw that.
Yeah, I tweeted about it.
Yes, and then they filled it in with dirt, and then the motorcyclists came and played in it. And one of the things that it reminded me of is what I love about these neighborhoods is it reminds you how smart people are.
Yeah.
How people, how you put in a dumb rule and people get around it. And one of the things I like about being in the slums, or I like about being in Hunts Point, is I'm reminded how much ingenuity there is in humans, that they'll take things that, I mean, part of me, after spent enough time in the Bronx, like the minute they said they put dirt in there, I'm like, man, the dirt bikers are going to come.
Totally.
And I'm glad they did, man.
Me too.
But it's it's like, again, and when you go in these places, you learn a lot about human creativity, and you learn a lot about ingenuity. I mean, that's the positive side. The negative side is people have to improvise, right? Like they're forced to improvise because they're usually in a position of being given the scraps. One of the things that brought me to Hunts Point initially, that I don't think I mentioned, was the pigeon keepers. I don't know if that was my first photo essay, was these guys who keep pigeons on, and it's almost all guys. I think there's 2 women who do it, but they keep pigeons on their roof. And I noticed at first when I was in Brooklyn, you see these swirls of beautiful pigeons, and they're choreographed. You just look at them initially, and then I remember looking up once and trying to figure out what they were. I had no idea that they were pigeon keepers. I saw this flag, white flag on a pole, being like basically on a bamboo pole, like 6 stories up, clearly directing the pigeons.
Wow.
And so I just walked into the building. It was an abandoned building. I walked up, and there was a rickety ladder up into the roof, and I stuck my head up there. There's some Puerto Rican guys. They're like, "Hey," like, "What, you keeping pigeons?" You're like, "Yeah." And they showed me, and so I got into this little world of pigeon keepers, which is all poor, mostly Puerto Ricans and Dominicans in the Bronx and Brooklyn, who find an abandoned building and put coops up there, and then have 1,000 pigeons.
Amazing.
They auction them. They go to weekly auctions where they buy pigeons. It's not pigeon racing. It's just, they just keep them and they fly them. And so, it's an example of, for me, when I went to Hunts Point, because in Hunts Point there's a lot of pigeon keepers. And it was another example of kind of the improvisation. For me, it's an art. I see pigeon keeping as an art form.
Right.
It's not a sport, because there's really you don't race them. You just kind of, sometimes you play games with other people. You try to steal their pigeons by getting them to come into your flock. If you see someone other's pigeons up, you put your pigeons up, and if you think your pigeons are better, some of theirs will join yours, and then you can steal some of their pigeons. So there's some competition there, but it's mostly good natured.
One of the things that struck out to me about your photography, and I wonder if this is the thing that you'll ultimately be most remembered for. Like, I think you're an exceptional photographer, and maybe that gets lost because of all the social political conversations around your work. And I know you've been criticized by other photojournalists for your technique, yes. I guess. I tried to read and understand the criticism. I didn't really get it.
I got mugged by the elites.
Yeah, I didn't even understand.
It was a completely cheap shot. But anyways, go ahead.
Well, what I notice is that, and I said earlier, sometimes with your photography, it's like there's a part of me that doesn't want to look at it. And then there's another part, I guess part of the criticism is, you're exploiting and you're turning something artistic and beautiful into something that's poverty, and maybe it's ugly. But I find with your photography is you don't shy away from the ugliness, and maybe that's not the right word to use, but the the
The
depravity.
graphicness.
Yeah, the graphicness. Thank you. That is there, but there's also in it an appreciation, a beauty, and an admiration of the human spirit, which is what I feel when you're talking about these guys with the pigeons.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, one of the things that, yeah, I tend to, I'm glad I wrote the book to stand alone without the photographs, but I am very, you know, I am proud of my photography, and it's what kind of drew me into this whole project because um, when I was going on these walks that we spoke about, I once I brought my camera, everything changed.
Right.
Because then it became people started opening up to me even more when when I would take their picture, they would want to talk. People would ask, people would ask me like, how do you get people to take your picture? It's the opposite. I have to stop people from wanting me to take their picture. It's like, so that's why the whole thing about the idea that I'm exploiting people when people I spent with 4 years with, who clearly gave me the all photography is exploitive and all journalism.
Right. Yeah.
It's just, and so I think I'm willing to have that conversation with the people who made the accusations, but they weren't going to have that conversation. They're just going to say they didn't like my political message, so they attacked me for something else. But the thing I always have trouble with is getting people to, it's like after a while you're like, no, I can't take any more pictures. I've taken 1,000 pictures of your pigeons or of whatever, but you got to give me a break. So yeah, people want their pictures taken, and what's interesting is how once they start asking their pictures to be taken, that was a way for people to open up to me.
Yeah.
So wherever I went, I always had my camera. And that was always a way. That's pretty much all I carry is my camera, and that was a way for people to start a conversation. I rarely start conversations. The fact that I'm a white guy often in a place where white guys are not rare, not especially one with camera, people come to me.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'll do is I'll sit in the McDonald's, and I usually sit if I'm in a town where I'm writing a story about the town. I'll stay there for like 2 weeks. And I'll just literally go to the same 2 McDonald's every night, 1 or 2 McDonald's, and just sit there and type up my notes. And eventually people come to me.
Right.
And, I know that they want to talk because I didn't start the process, and so that's an important for me to know that, they're willing, they know what's in it. They know if there's a guy,
right.
For them to start the conversation instead of me starting it.
Yeah. I would imagine that you have to work hard at earning their trust.
Right. But the photograph, the thing about photography, the problem with photography for me though is there's a lot of people who just think the photograph should stand alone. I don't believe that. I think that photos are very powerful, but I think unaccompanied by context,
right,
they can lose a lot of their power. And so I like to, what I'm most proud of is combining the two in a balance. I think that works. But the pigeons, but also photography. If your goal is to take photos, I think it's easier to find the beauty because you're looking for beauty.
Right.
And you'll find beauty in places, again, the pigeon keepers, which I don't think a lot of people, pigeons in nicer neighborhoods, pigeons are literally considered, rats with wings. And I remember this old pigeon keeper telling me in Park Slope, he's Alaska, you can't keep pigeons in Park Slope anymore. And if your listeners don't know, Park Slope is it's a part of Brooklyn that's been very gentrified, I guess, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. It's a bit cartoonishly mocked as being very liberal, educated liberals. And, and who have ironically pushed out the minorities who used to live there. And the guy who used to be the last pigeon keeper was telling me, he said something like, when white people move into your neighborhood, all they care about is dogs and cats, and everything else is, he had to get rid of his. You can't keep chickens anymore in your backyards in Park Slope, and you can't keep pigeons on their roof. So pigeons are kind of considered lowbrow, but they're an art form. And the other one is the one other thing I found in the Bronx I took pictures of that I liked is the Schwinn bike clubs.
Uh-huh.
They, Schwinn bikes are the things that I don't know if in Canada you had it, but if you grew up in the 60s or 50s, you ordered from the Sears catalog, the starter bike, that the one with the banana seat, and the tassels, and a lot of female
I
bikes.
remember.
They probably they've been dismissed now by the wealthy and the educated, who've moved on to like fixed wheel 10 speeds and things. But in the Bronx and in poorer neighborhoods, there's clubs devoted to Schwinn's, and they fix them up and they turn them into these, either they restore them to tradition, or they pimp them out. And so you have these old these bike clubs of like 50 mostly Latino guys riding around the Bronx on these Schwinn's. And again, it's improvisation. It's turning something that's been discarded by others into an art form. And some of them are gorgeous. They got, especially proud of the 70-year-old masculine guy with tattoos who's very proud of his old girlish pink Schwinn for the 60s he fixed up.
Is it lonely for you, this path you've taken?
I think on the road it can get to be, like I said, I make friends at the McDonald's. I actually like, people ask me about the long driving. I mean, I think the longest drive I did was 1,500 miles in one day, sort of thing. But I like long distance driving. It's very relaxing. It's very, some people have meditation. For me, it's 12-hour drive is my meditation. So,
but I'm thinking about, the stories the story you just shared and the excitement you have over at the Schwinn bike clubs and the pigeons. And is that a story with your friends that they're interested in, that they resonate with? Or do you feel a little bit alone in your excitement and in your appreciation of these things, where maybe they're, as you said in the last podcast, more interested in, building a beautiful home or having a beautiful wedding or whatever it is, which is fine. It's just different.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's been hard. I think not everybody in my life shares my unique interests, but that's where Twitter helps, right? Where I badmouth Twitter, but when I find these things, I can say it on Twitter, and you'll find, again, the great thing about social media is you say it and someone's like, oh yeah, my granddad does that, and someone from like, El Paso, like, yeah, when you're in El Paso, come through, we'll show you our Schwinn bike club. So you start finding that there are people out there who appreciate it, and you learn a lot from it. Like, I learned a lot about the pigeon keepers on Twitter and on Flickr, where people gave me feedback and saying, hey, my grandfather, this was brought over by the Germans in 1920, who did it. And, and you'll find the following guy who's still in Ridgewood, Queens, is the last guy to do it, last German guy, a lot of things like that. So it's, in that sense, you find a community of people who are into it. But, I mean, it's hard to get people sometimes interested in what I'm interested in,
And I can hear, I've sort of talked about the criticism and some of the assholes on Twitter and people who don't get it. And I assume, as you just said, it's brought you a lot of connection with people. And because your book and your work is largely, from, you can tell me if I'm wrong, been well received, and it's had an impact. You've had an impact.
It's been, I don't know if we spoke about this last time, it's been well received much more from the right wing than from the left wing, which surprised me.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, it has been overall positive. And, I don't, even if it had been negative, I would have still done it, as, I'm kind of at a very selfish level. As I said before, I'm doing it for myself.
Where do you see the state of the issue right now? Like, I mean, and is there a political solution to the what's going on in the United States around poverty and the addiction and the frustration, the humiliation, the shame, the disaffected groups of people? Is there a political solution? And if so, what do you think it is?
I don't know. I mean, bad policy got us into this mess.
Right.
I'm not sure I'm not sure you can unwind it, unfortunately. Um, you know, I think there are certain policy decisions I certainly would like to change. Um, I'd like to see us rewind little bit in how we treat, um, you know, how we over. There's been a big policy shift that has basically put profits over workers at every level.
Yeah.
And I think there's ones that the left sees and the ones that the right sees, but neither agrees. I mean, you know, I think the ones that I think people will fail to acknowledge, I think a lot of the left sees the obvious ones. Um, the breakup of unions, the removal of or the means testing of a lot of social security, a lot of the safety net,
Mm-hmm.
putting the market in places where the market shouldn't be. But I think they also missed some of the more obvious ones, the bigger ones, which is um, the overemphasis on globalism in terms of trade,
Yeah.
the kind of way we've, as I said before, we've inserted the market in absolutely everything. So, the center left, generally the Obama types, the Clinton types, were as responsible as Republicans as putting the market in place into everything. Denationalizing everything, deregulating everything, and kind of making it, you know, this kind of system where we all having a resume arms race. How we get to a place where we're not having a resume arms race, where
Right.
we value more than just education and we value more than just money. I don't know how you get there. I know the policies that we could move back to valuing labor and place over profits. There's a lot of policies that will get. I don't know if it's going to get us all the way there because how do you get people to just feel there's just some places where the government can't. I don't believe. I'm not a big government believer. I don't believe the government. I'm libertarian in that sense that I think that we need less regulation. Um, it's the classic example of bad government and bad regulation is putting the sand in the pool, man. Skate park, that's just. I'm for less interferences in people's lives, but how do we get back to a place where culture, the society values um, things like place and faith as much as they value money? And I don't think that's anything that comes. That's a bottom up thing. That's not a top. You can't impose that. And so, if I have a political home these days, because I certainly don't feel that much as welcome on the left as I used to, and I certainly don't feel welcome on the right in many ways. It's kind of localism. It's kind of this idea that you know, one of the things I wish I had put in my book is kind of the success. What I see as the people I met who were living fulfilled lives, who were really out there, kind of the people I kind of admired most, who seemed the happiest and doing the quote best good, were people like teachers at the El Paso Community College, people who were doing local good. They weren't on Twitter bragging about helping 25 students, from lower income neighborhoods find a job, or negotiate their their parents' divorce or whatever, because if you're a teacher at a community college, you're also a social worker, or the local minister, in Selma, who was took an old, bookstore and turned it into a church. Those people who were just living their lives and doing good in their community and not bragging about it.
Yeah.
They were doing it because it was the right choice. And if somehow you can have a wellspring of that, of local communism that empowers people in their community without also being braggy about it for for show. I mean, you do it for the right reasons because it's the right thing to do, not because you want attention. And I think we have this kind of culture, that wants quick fixes. So, you want to solve poverty like that. You want to solve poverty by putting, um, one of the, I think just a lot of the TED Talks, we're going to solve poverty by putting farms on rooftops. Like that's a nice idea. I'm all for putting farms on rooftops, but it's not going to solve poverty. I don't. We got to do a lot of these things in aggregate, and not expect anyone to just be the magic solution.